The new Batman Adventures episode, Sins of the Father, is an episode about inheritance. It's about what gets passed down when adults fail, when systems rot, and when the people who are meant to protect you either disappear or become something worse. Everyone in this story is living with someone else's mistakes, and the episode is less interested in whether they fail than in what they choose to do next. Take for instance the new Robin, Tim Drake. His introduction does several things at once, and none of them are obvious on a first viewing. On paper, this is Tim Drake's debut as Robin, although if you're familiar with the comic book original, then this episode may seem confusing. Their version of Tim is a streetwise kid living alone and stealing to survive. He is connected directly to Gotham's criminal underworld through his father's association with Two-Face. And that's a very important point because it immediately places Tim inside of Batman's war on crime, rather than adjacent to it. Comic book Tim Drake, by contrast, was defined by balance and emotional stability. He became Robin not because he was reckless or desperate, but because he believed Batman needed one. His intelligence, restraint and moral clarity were his defining traits and were key to his success as a character. The DCAU version skips almost all of that, although he is still a Batman fanboy. In truth, he's closer to Jason Todd's post-crisis reinvention, a kid forged by neglect, danger and proximity to organised crime. That decision wasn't accidental. Naming the character Tim Drake allowed the series to align with the comics of the late 1990s, where Tim was the active Robin, while sneakily avoiding the baggage that came with Jason Todd. Jason had famously been killed in the comics via a fan vote. Even years later, he carried the stigma of being the Robin people wanted gone, even if there's evidence to suggest that the poll was tampered with. But that is an entirely separate matter. The point is that introducing a new sidekick under that name ran the risk of sinking the character before he even spoke. So, Sins of the Father gives us a compromise: Jason Todd's circumstances and Tim Drake's name. What the episode does exceptionally well is justify Batman's involvement. Tim's father's decision to leave him behind, and worse, entrust him with a key to a weapon capable of mass murder, turns him into collateral damage in Two-Face's escalation from mob boss to terrorist. This is also where we see a marked shift in Harvey Dent's characterization. No longer obsessed with organised crime as a system to be controlled, he's now indiscriminately lethal, willing to murder a child and hold the city hostage. And unlike Dick Grayson, Tim doesn't become Robin because Batman believes he's ready. He becomes Robin as an act of defiance, stealing the costume and joining in with the adventure despite being told not to. The Robin costume reinforces that unease. It's kept in a display cabinet framed like a memorial, which is an image that carries a very different meaning for comic book readers familiar with Jason Todd's death. For most of the episode, it suggests absence, finality and failure. Only at the end does that meaning shift when Dick Grayson steps out of the shadows and reminds us that Robin is a role people eventually outgrow. This really makes clear that a lot of time has passed, as does Two-Face's change in personality. Within a few moments of seeing him again, it's clear that he's no longer the same villain we met in Batman the Animated Series. In BTAS, Two-Face still believed he was finishing Harvey Dent's work. His schemes were aimed at organised crime. His violence, while brutal, was selective. He went after mob fronts, corrupt institutions, and power structures that enabled organised crime. That version of Two-Face had a code, but in Sins of the Father, that code is gone. Here, Two-Face murders Tim Drake's father without hesitation, discards him once he's no longer useful, and escalates directly to terrorism, threatening Gotham with a dirty bomb if his demands aren't met. There's no world in which this is criminal pragmatism or a warped continuation of Harvey Dent's ideals. He's simply threatening people to make money. What's important is that this isn't presented as a random mischaracterization or gross simplification of the man. In BTAS, Two-Face was still tethered, however loosely, to Harvey Dent. By TNBA, that tether has snapped. Two-Face has become indistinguishable from Gotham's corruption. And narratively speaking, Two-Face has become a distorted mirror of the episode's core theme of inheritance. Tim Drake is burdened by his father's sins, but actively resists repeating them. Two-Face is the opposite. Harvey Dent was offered chances, recovery, reconciliation, a return to purpose, and rejected them. Where Tim moves forward, Two-Face calcifies. One chooses transformation, the other chooses to double down and rot. That's why Two-Face works so well as the villain for Robin's origin in this continuity. He represents the fate Tim narrowly avoids, a child destined by neglect, pulled into crime, and left to justify it as necessity. Now, I'm in a fairly unique position as a content creator talking about these shows. I get exposed to a lot of different opinions. Something I've noticed recently, especially following my series of videos about Mr. Freeze's character development, is that some fans write off TNBA because it is far less hopeful. They look at how sympathetic BTAS villains like Mr. Freeze, Two-Face and Clayface were presented in TNBA and balk at them. They were less sympathetic and downright evil. But I wouldn't say that Sins of the Father diminishes Two-Face. What it does is hardens him. He's no longer tragic because he fell, he's tragic because, when given the chance to climb back out, he chose not to. It may not be as relatable, but it is still a tragedy. And that is what makes him a great antagonist for a story about what happens when the sins of one generation land squarely on the shoulders of the next. The title of the episode really flags this theme. The term Sins of the Father comes from the Bible, and it refers to the idea that the sins of the father will be passed across subsequent generations. A less literal interpretation is that children inherit the consequences of choices they didn't make. Damage has a way of travelling down the family line, whether it's deserved or not. That idea plays out most clearly through Tim Drake. Tim is hunted, endangered, and nearly killed because of his father's past as a criminal and his final act of abandonment. Stephen Drake's choices leave his son exposed, alone, and forced into a world that he never chose to enter. There's also a social element of generational inheritance. Batman explicitly notes that Stephen Drake had been involved in crime since childhood, a product not only of his own choices but of the environment he was born into. Gotham's streets offer few legitimate paths, jobs are scarce, opportunity scarcer, and survival often means bending the rules or breaking them outright. For Stephen, crime was one of the only ways to navigate a city structured to trap its underclass, and that's how he ended up employed by Two-Face. By framing crime as both personal and systemic, Sins of the Father deepens its exploration of legacy. Tim was born into a cycle of generational poverty and neglect. The episode shows how he breaks that cycle. Tim doesn't become Robin because he's destined to be, or because Batman decided to seek out a new one. He becomes Robin because his father's sins leave him with no safe place to stand. By becoming Robin, he resists becoming his father. He takes what he's inherited, the danger, the neglect and proximity to crime, and redirects it towards something constructive. Two-Face represents the opposite response. Harvey Dent isn't crushed by someone else's wrongdoing, he's undone by his refusal to take responsibility for his own. Where Tim breaks the cycle, Two-Face entrenches it. He uses chance and grievance to absolve himself, escalating from targeted criminality to mass terror. His sins aren't passed down to him, they're chosen, repeated, and pushed outwards. Placed between them is Batman, a man still defined by a crime committed against his parents decades earlier. He understands inheritance better than anyone in the room, yet he responds by building systems rather than offering guidance. In Sins of the Father, the question isn't whether damage is inherited, because it clearly is. The question is what you do once it's in your hands. And in Gotham, the choice is the only thing that separates a Robin from a Two-Face. So, in that sense, Sins of the Father is, more than almost any other episode, a statement of intent. It tells you exactly what the new Batman Adventures wants to be, and it does so far more clearly than the episode that actually opened the series. Where BTAS often framed its stories as moral tragedies, TNBA is colder, leaner, and far less interested in reassurance. Sins of the Father wastes no time in establishing that shift. A child is hunted by criminals, a father is murdered off-screen and dumped in a river, a supervillain threatens mass murder with a dirty bomb. Tonally, it's completely different to BTAS. That is also why I think Sins of the Father would have worked far better as the first episode rather than Holiday Nights. Holiday Nights operates like a reunion special, assuming familiarity. It drops the new Robin into the story without explanation. It completely spoils Clayface's resurrection and plays like a curtain call for characters the audience hasn't been reintroduced to yet. As a finale, it would have worked perfectly. As an introduction, it does not. By contrast, Sins of the Father introduces the new status quo clearly. It explains who Robin is and why he exists. It establishes Batgirl as a permanent presence, and it defines Batman's emotional distance as a feature, not a glitch. Even Dick Grayson's final scene serves as a bridge between eras, not a nostalgic callback. But most importantly, it highlights TNBA's core theme: legacy. Everyone in this episode is dealing with what they've inherited. Tim Drake inherits his father's mess and refuses to let it define him. Two-Face inherits his own unresolved choices and lets them fester. Batman inherits his own failures and responds by building walls instead of bridges. The Bat family itself becomes less about found family and more about damage control. They're people stepping into roles not necessarily because they want to, but because someone has to. That's a very different show to BTAS, and a key reason why I will refuse to call it Batman the Animated Series Season 4, despite what box sets and streaming platforms say. Where BTAS offered moral tragedies softened by hope, TNBA strips that away. It's a world where choices, not destiny, decide whether you become a Robin, a Two-Face, or someone in between. Okay, that's it for this essay. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really liked the video and feel like tossing a buck or two my way, please consider using the thanks button, because every little helps. And if you have really enjoyed my work, you might want to pick up a copy of my book, Rogues Gallery. It features 22 essays on villains from Batman the Animated Series. There's a beautiful cover by Batman the Animated Series background artist John Calmette, a foreword by director Dan Reber, and a moving segment from the late Kevin Conroy sharing his thoughts on life, love, and loss. Plus, an exclusive essay on the Condiment King that will never be made into a video. Rogues Gallery is available worldwide on Amazon, both digitally and in softcover. And special thanks to my channel members. Everyone who was a member at the time of this video's creation is listed on the screen right now. If you want to see your name amongst all these wonderful people, join the channel now. And while I have your attention, please consider checking out my other channel, Serum Lake Comics, where I talk about mostly DC comic books. Next time, I'll be back on Friday with a video talking about the DCAU's unstoppable reporter who's always one step ahead, fearless in pursuit of the story and never afraid to shake up Metropolis. Yes, it's time to talk about Lois Lane. And next Monday I'm following up on one of my earliest videos. Now, I've talked about how Two-Face Part 1 is the best episode of Batman the Animated Series, but I skipped over the second part. Well, now it's time to talk about that and how it delivers a wild ride of tragedy, chaos, and moral collapse. Hope to see you then.